Okay, let's find out. Is Israel based? Now, with my last Is It Based videos, I went through a list of topics: support for traditional families, support for the general welfare of the primary ethnic group of the state, support for the continued existence of that ethnic group as an inheritance, promotion of the traditional culture of that ethnic group, and overall the sovereignty and stability of the state. I do have a preface before that and a conclusion after those five factors. So now let's get into Israel. First, I'll hit on the preface here. Israel is a Western country, or at least viewed as a Western country within the wider bloc of Western influence. If viewed under such a framework, Israel can be seen as one of the more healthy Western states and indeed societies. Israel has the highest birth rate of all Western nations and is seeing a great religious revival connected to that birth rate. Likewise, Israel was founded explicitly as a nation state for the benefit of its primary ethnic group, the Jewish people. Yet Israel is widely despised amongst the dissidents of the right. Why? The easiest answer is that the Western right are overwhelmingly Christian. Christianity and Judaism are two different religions which are diametrically opposed to each other. While Christians currently are perhaps the most positively inclined to Judaism than at any point throughout the entire history of the religion, this seems to be merely a fad and has already peaked. With the decline of dispensationalism and Protestantism and the Holocaust beginning to leave the memory of most people throughout the globe, this curious phase of Christian philo-Semitism seems to be on the decline, although it's a soft decline right now. It doesn't seem to be very fast, but it is a decline nonetheless, and decade by decade you can tell that it's declining. The Christian goodwill towards the Jews appears to be only one way, though, with Jews continuing to take a rather dismal view of Christianity. Members of the dissident right are aware of this, and that this contributes to their indifference to Israel or outright disdain for the country. I think that the second reason pertains to the real crux of the issue, though. Jews have a deep aversion to the traditions of Western cultures and the movements that champion it. This aversion, in some sense, is understood as Jews have been victims to persecution within Europe, and there is a tradition of anti-Semitism on the right. The problem, though, is that Israel's continued existence depends upon connections and even sponsorship from the West. Yet, they refuse to see themselves as members of the West and as a country which, by its very structure, has unique similarities with the positions of the dissident right in the Western nations. And that's because Israel has an explicit ethno-nationalist justification for its statehood, and the Zionism has origins within the European nationalist movements of the 19th century. As Europe and the wider Western world face collapse or even extinction with unprecedented mass immigration from the Third World, the right of Israel refuses to show solidarity with what would be their natural allies, and indeed will often remain disdainful of them. As such, as the West is being transformed and getting closer and closer to the precipice of extinction, Israelis and their government continue to disdain their allies. The mass flood of immigration in the West likewise is showing deep sympathy for the Palestinians and their cause, and the marked hatred for the Zionist cause. The rising anti-Semitism, which is bolstered by limitless immigration from the Third World, and especially the Arab world, is in fact more anti-Semitic than all but the most vehement National Socialist elements within Western cultures. Under their anti-colonialist critique of Israel, these new left-wing anti-Zionists are calling for the complete expulsion of Jews from the Middle East and for Israel to cease to exist as a country. If that were to happen, that would result in the deaths of a substantial portion of Jews worldwide. Despite this rising anti-Zionism amongst the historically, racially European states of the world, Israelis are acting just like the scorpion in the parable of the frog and the scorpion. The Israelis depend upon the sympathies of the West for their very survival, as Israel is a weak and nearly undefendable state. The West, then, is the frog. in particular the right-wing West, the right-wing European whites. They're the frog, and they are offering Israel the scorpion, flight across the river on the frog's back. The Jews, the scorpion climbs onto the frog, but the Israelis have a failure to see the necessity of the frog, the West, for their survival. They sting the frog, kill it, cause it to drown, and kill themselves, dying by their very own hand. Now, with that analogy done, let's get into the main part of the series. I'm going to start with support for traditional families. The TFR of Israel, the total fertility rate that is around 2.9 children per woman, constituting the highest in the West. There are no other Western nations that have a birth rate even above replacement level as 2.1 children per woman. And that's including the southern cone of South America with Chile, Paraguay, and Argentina. This birth rate in Israel is held up by the expansive growth of the ultra-Orthodox Jews, but secular Jews also have above replacement fertility. The ultra-Orthodox have a religious commitment to high fertility, and the closed communal society that they champion is the most resistant of all societal forms of decline of fertility in the modern world. But it should be noted that Israel in general has a more pronatalist culture than many of its peer nations throughout the West. One unique aspect of this is that Israeli grandparents have a strong dedication and commitment to their grandchildren and invest a great deal in their lives compared to the peers in other Western countries. So Israeli grandparents often absorb the cost of women in the workplace, and they take care of the grandchildren while the mothers work. Thus Israel, to a certain extent, is able to eat both the fruits of the feminist drive for putting women into the workforce and spit out its bitter pit of low fertility. While Israel has some supports for the LGBT movement, they do not recognize gay marriage. There is recognition for some civil unions and adoption for gay couples. It does not seem, though, that Israel is on a trajectory for full acceptance of homosexual marriages, as a country, for clear demographic reasons, is on a trajectory towards increasing social conservatism. It should be noted also that Israel does not have civil marriage. Rather, all marriages are religious. Israel remains in the middle for countries globally in divorce rate, but the increasing rise in ultra-Orthodoxy in the country actually doesn't mean a decline for divorce. Indeed, divorce is continuing to increase in Israel despite its plateau in other Western countries. While it is under most Western countries in the amount of divorce, and divorce is slowly increasing, if this isn't checked, Israel's divorce rate will reach that of the high Western plateau that we're seeing now in most Western countries, around 40 to 50% of marriages ending in divorce. Israel has pretty liberal abortion laws in every respect but one. The country does not allow elective abortions. In Israel, abortion is approved by a review committee. Abortions are allowed in risk to the mother's life, her health, in cases of rape and incest, and in cases of birth defects. Even though they're elective, there's no real limits upon them. And a permission to abortion is almost never not granted. Abortion was initially legalized in the country in 1977, and the law was expanded to its current status, which is very close to being elective, in 2014. It should be noted, though, that the vast majority of abortions are carried out in the first trimester in the country. Many of the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel, which are growing more and more powerful in every election cycle, are pro-life, and as such, it's quite possible that Israel will be seeing more and more restrictive laws to try and contain abortion. Okay, we're at the next part of the video. Support for the general welfare of the primary ethnic group of the state. The Zionist movement led to the return of the Jewish people to Palestine, slowly at first, with minimal immigration in the region in the late 19th and the first half of the 20th centuries. But following World War II and a flood of Jewish refugees, that gave birth to the first Jewish ethnic state since the Bar Kokhba revolt of the 2nd century, that being, of course, the modern Republic of Israel. After the expulsion of Middle Eastern Jews in the wake of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, further legitimacy was granted the State of Israel as there was a population transfer of the indigenous Palestinians on one side and a population transfer of indigenous Middle Eastern Masoreti Jews into Israel proper. And since that time, Israel's right to return for Jews worldwide has only supported the general well-being worldwide by providing them a home. Initially, there has been some controversy if the non-Caucasian Jews of East Africa were in fact eligible to the right of return. Eventually, though, the courts of Israel granted in their favor in viewing Beta Israel as Jews racially, or at least ethnically. And as such, by that decision, Jews within Israel have become more of a religious entity than a purely racial or ethnic one. So in the wake of that ruling, the vast majority of East African Jews have migrated to Israel, often with the explicit support of state organs, doing special quasi-military operations to directly import East African Jews as immigrants into the country. And now East African Jews constitute somewhere around 2% of the total population of Israel. The migration of Beta Israel into Israel proper has been condemned by the Israeli right, as some view them as essentially just LARPers who lie about their origin in order to immigrate to the richer country of Israel. This LARP they feel is dangerous as they think it undermines the Jewish identity and opens the door for Jewish Reconstructionist movements throughout the world to try and immigrate into Israel. Indeed, Beta Israel is more distinct racially to the rest of the Jewish people than the Palestinians are. There is also concern that Beta Israelis commit more crime than the main body of the Jewish people. In the wake of the 1948 Israeli-Arab War, there was the aforementioned population transfer of indigenous Palestinians and the Masoreti Jews who had lived in the various countries of the Middle East prior to the creation of the Republic of Israel. While the majority of Palestinians were expelled or left to their own accord, there was a distinct minority who stayed within what became the borders of the modern state of Israel, and so they were granted Israeli citizenship. These remaining Palestinians became known as the 48 Arabs, and while initially then only constituting only a small minority, these remaining Palestinians, due to their large birth rate, would grow to become a substantial minority in the country, comprising about a little over a fifth of the total population. Indeed, had it not been for the explosive growth of the ultra-Orthodox Jews due to their disproportionate higher fertility, then Israel could have actually been overrun by the Israeli Arabs proper, and the Jews would have become a minority within their own state. The Arab Israeli citizens have the second highest fertility rate in the nation total, that being, of course, after the ultra-Orthodox Jews. But despite the ultra-Orthodox Jews becoming a larger and larger portion of the population, the Arab Israelis will hover around a fifth of the population, at least for the first half of the 21st century if trends continue. That is unless there is, of course, an exodus of Jews seeking their right of return to Israel and establishing themselves there. If that were to happen, though, that would be more bad than good. The fleeing of Jews in the West, in countries such as the United States, Britain, or Argentina, the three countries with the most populous Jewish populations after Israel itself, if they were to flee, that might improve the demographic situation within Israel, would ultimately constitute a greater danger in the long term, is that Israel depends upon those, the patronage of those peoples within other countries, and the influence of Jews throughout the West in order to survive. Okay, now let's get to the support of the continued existence of that ethnic group and its inheritance. As long as the Arab Israelis are in the country, they are doomed to being second-class citizens. Despite whatever alliances that they may make with the Israeli left and whatever guarantees they may be given through legal equality, they are always going to be viewed from themselves as being outsiders and viewed by the Jews as being outsiders. This will only get worse as the ultra-Orthodox will become an ever greater proportion of the population. as the ultra-Orthodox are the Jews with the most dismal view of the Arab Israelis. Since Palestine and Israel are separate entities and are going to be forever in antipathy to one another, this is already bad enough, but Israel is also entangled in what is supposed to be the very core of the Palestinian nation, the West Bank. This entanglement merges the two countries together cohesively into a single entity, and it undermines Israel's claim to be a nation of refugees and makes them, in the eyes of the world, into an aggressor, which is aggressively colonizing the land of the indigenous Palestinians. Under the two-state solution system, which Israel historically, or at least a few decades ago, it was said that they were trying to pursue, Israel and Palestine were supposed to be two different entities. Israel was supposed to respect Palestine and allow it to become a state. Likewise, Palestine was supposed to recognize the existence and legitimacy of Israel and not try to wipe it off the face of the earth. So in the Oslo Accords of 1993, which was the high point in the movement towards peace and the two-state solution, both sides agreed to this, agreed to try and allow Israel and Palestine to become two coherent separate entities. And it should be noted, of course, there were dissidents on both sides who refused to accept this agreement, but this agreement really laid a foundation for the mutual coexistence of the two parties as distinct sovereign entities. And I want to note this too. Palestine got a much worse deal out of this two-state solution system than Israel did. They got a lot less land, and their land was divided into enclaves, which are not directly connected. And, everybody knows the two enclaves, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Of course, though, ultimately Israel did not recognize these borders and continuously undermined the two-state solution through its occupation of the West Bank and by supporting illegal immigration of Israeli citizens into the West Bank. It then uses its military to cleft Palestinian lands apart within the West Bank and to award the best land there and its water rights to Israelis. The Israeli state has consistently undermined the two-state solution by its piecemeal absorption and de facto annexation of the West Bank. The reasoning for this is that the existing borders of Israel are essentially undefendable, and that's because Israel is a flat coastal plain with no depth, and the West Bank constitutes the high ground which overlooks that coastal plain. Thus, if any foreign power were to put troops within the West Bank, that would spell the doom of Israel, as it would be very easy to overwhelm the nearly undefendable coastal plains which constitute the majority of the modern Republic of Israel. Thus, it is very clear as to the reason why Israel is very unlikely to ever abandon a military occupation of the West Bank. And that's regardless of whatever wishes or statements the politicians of Israel will make. With the intermixing of the Palestinians and the Israelis in both Israel proper with the 48 Arabs and within Palestine proper with the colonists in the West Bank, the borders of what constitutes Israel and Palestine are murky. Of course, the reality is that the borders are not simply murky. In reality, they don't actually exist. The Palestinian Authority is something akin to a legal facade with no reality beyond existing on a piece of paper. It's like the state of Manchu Kuo in Japanese-occupied Manchuria or the princely states within British India. Israel, as a de facto, controls the internationally recognized borders of Israel itself, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Since this is the reality, the Jews are simply a plurality or slight majority over the country which they claim to be their own ethno-state. The Palestinians in the West Bank are rendered powerless in regards to their own destinies and made to be third-class citizens with no rights in their own homeland. Israel is therefore an apartheid state which has three layers of citizenship. The highest tier being the Jews, of course, the middle tier being Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, the 48 Arabs, and the lowest tier being the Palestinians of the West Bank and the Syrians of the Golan Heights. They have no legal rights or protections. Thus, having the legal privileges and access to the freedoms of the Jews, though, the Arab Israelis will always be second class citizens because they are, by their very nature, going to have some sort of loyalty to their countrymen that are third class citizens in the West Bank and, somewhat sovereign in the Gaza Strip. As such, the Arab Israelis constitute a grave danger to Israel as they can always act as a fifth column within the borders of the country itself. The right of Israel recognizes this reality, and by doing so, they further the otherness of the Arab Israelis. But they, do not act to either disenfranchise them or expel them. So their existence, the existence of the Arab Israelis, is something like a Chinese finger trap in which the demographics of Israel are going to pull apart the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab Israelis and making them increasingly at odds with each other. The disenfranchisement of the Palestinians within their own land causes the world at large to detest Israel. But the forces at play in Israel mean that the country has no choice but to maintain control of the West Bank. And the more integrated the Jews and the Palestinians become, the more that they will end up detesting one another. Okay, now we are getting into the promotion of the traditional culture of the ethnic group. Israel was founded largely by secular Jews and Jews who only had weak adherence to their religion. During the Holocaust, the majority of Orthodox Jews who were native to Eastern Europe and were the most strongest adherents to the Jewish religion died off. It should be noted that many Orthodox Jews initially did not believe in the resettlement of Israel, as they did not believe it was justified or confirmed by God in the way that the religion said it had to be. And so only a small minority of the initial Jews who settled in Israel proper were ultra-Orthodox. These ultra-Orthodox Jews were awarded special privileges by the state. These special privileges included exemption from military service and certain subsidies. At that time, the leftist secular government of Israel didn't view these benefits to the ultra-Orthodox to be particularly problematic, as the ultra-Orthodox constitute a very tiny percentage of the total population, and they thought that it was important to try and foster the Jewish religion. Yet, that has changed. The ultra-Orthodox have a very high fertility rate and are quickly outgrowing all other groups and are coming to dominate Israel. They have this high fertility rate in part because their religion is pronatalist. But it also has to do with their communal lifestyle. And that communal lifestyle is the most resilient lifestyle and resists best of all lifestyles the ever-present push of the modern world to lower birth rates. And that is not helped by the substantial subsidies that the government has granted them. So the explosive growth of the Orthodox Jews means the Knesset, or the legislature of Israel, will become an Orthodox body within the decades to come. And that is because the Knesset has one of the lowest thresholds for a party to enter in the world, and because it is not constituted geographically, but simply by percentage of voters. So with their increasing numbers, it's leading to a rise in voting power for the various ultra-Orthodox parties within the Knesset. And now they're able to force the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu's center-right Likud party to give them several concessions, and so for Likud to stay in power. And even though that these concessions aren't popular with the Israeli public at large, the Likud has no other choice but to go along with them. And right now, because there's been so many failures of government and so many government collapses, the only viable government is a weak Likud government with alliances with these various ultra-Orthodox far-right parties. The polarized demographics of Israel and the rising power of the far-right ultra-Orthodox parties are causing governments to be almost impossible to form. Thus, governments are falling apart rather quickly, and there is not a broad spectrum of agreement in the country. And the ultra-Orthodox are a rising power who disagree with most other groups with their social and foreign policy goals. The ultra-Orthodox are one of the most jingoistic consistencies in the country, but are not made to serve in the military. when they are the ones that are most willingly to lead the country into wars. Likewise, their communal way of life is not particularly productive economically. Israel is a somewhat successful country for its tech industry and its financial industry on the global stage, but is particularly successful when compared with its neighbors. Yet the ultra Orthodox, with their low workforce participation, tend to absorb welfare. So as they continue to increase, the country will likely be weighed down by their ever increasingly larger portion of the population. Now let's get to the fifth category, right? The sovereignty and stability of the state. As the ultra-Orthodox leech off the Israeli government and become a larger and larger proportion of the population, the nature of Israel's democracy is at stake, and it's increasingly becoming impossible for the state to revoke the privileges which it has accorded to the ultra-Orthodox, leading to an intractable problem which its democracy will fail to resolve. The core population of the secular and less religiously observant Jews are being parasited by the ultra-Orthodox economically, but even more importantly, parasited militarily, as the ultra-Orthodox are the spear of the colonization of the West Bank, and are most often the most jingoistic member of the populace within Israel, but paradoxically are not required to be enlisted in the military, and so they are not required to fight the wars which are waged on their behalf. It seems, with the intractable problems that the Israeli democracy faces, and for the society which is already heavily militarized, then the simplest way out of its intractable demographic and democratic problems is to overthrow this weak democracy with a junta. And so that junta would be the only thing which could revoke the economic privileges of the ultra-Orthodox and ultimately force them into mandatory conscription. Of course, that would be a disaster, though, for Israel's international image, at least for its international image with the liberal West. And that would make their already disdained image as an apartheid state even worse within the eyes of the liberal West. Israel is too small and undefendable to stand on its own without Western support. Yet its apartheid state image is souring its view from the world abroad. And it's such that heritage European majority countries of the West are becoming ever less sympathetic to the cause of Zionism as mass immigration replaces the native populations of those countries. Likewise, the intractable nature of Israel's democracy, in light of the expanding demographics of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, makes a military dictatorship seemingly inevitable. As such, a military dictatorship would only be more demonized by the post-liberal dictatorships that are likely to develop within the minority-majority countries, which it seems the Western Europe and North America are doomed to become. Israel really depends upon Western Jews, which have close ties to the country. Yet these Jews, these Western Jews outside of Israel, by and large are more left-wing leaning than their Middle Eastern counterparts within Israel. And a substantial portion of them are actually pro-Palestinian, sometimes the most vehemently pro-Palestinian of all Westerners. Indeed, many left-wing Jews make up the vanguard of the anti-Zionist cause within the West. Many of these Jews in the West, even though if they're not anti-Zionist and are supportive of Israel, are actively hostile, though, to the native right-wing movements within the countries they're currently living. And that hostility only fuels the right-wing anti-Semitic backlash, as the Western right rightly holds that, rightly I believe, to be hypocritical of the Western Jews outside of Israel. As anti-Semitism increases in the heritage European countries of Western Europe and North America, many Jews within the broader West are likely to immigrate to Israel to escape that hostile environment. Yet that would be leaving the frying pan and jumping into the fire, as while their entry into Israel may fortify the Jewish majority within Israel proper, it would cut Israel off from Western support, something which the precarious and small and besieged nation needs in order to survive. As it stands now, Israel is utterly dependent upon the United States for its patronage. But the twilight of the United States, because of its demographic problems and the declining popularity already of Israel within the minds of the Americans, will only lead Israel to becoming a pariah state on the world stage without any support. Indeed, the Biden administration is already forcing Israel to a certain extent to heal and allow for humanitarian breaks within its current siege of Gaza. Israel is too small to be self-sufficient if it becomes a true pariah state. While Israel is dependent upon American industries now giving it gifts of aid to its military, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The Israeli military would have a great difficulty in becoming self-sufficient with American gifts. But it gets even worse than that. And that's because if Israel were to become a pariah nation, it would be screwed. Because America needs the support of America's clout throughout the world for its vital long-term interest. That main vital long-term interest being trade. Israel is a small nation with little to no natural resources. It needs to trade with the outside world in order to survive. But if America is not able to provide for Israel and protect them upon the world stage, then Israel could end up not being traded with if it were to become a true pariah state. Indeed, if America were to decline or even turn against Israel, then a large number of the countries of the world, and especially the Arab world, would likely pull out their trade and deprive the Israeli economy of what it needs to survive. And so currently, while Israel, pound for pound, may be a very powerful country militarily, and one which has nuclear weapons at its disposal, that military is largely fed by American aid. And if the international community were to pull back its trade and pull back its resources, then it's questionable how long that military could really stand. Because if Israel found itself to be a true pariah nation cut off from the rest of the world, then all the Arab states really would need to do in order to defeat Israel is to wait for its military to decline from being starved out of natural resources. After all, what good is an advanced military with limited or no ammunition? Ultimately, Israel would be defeated by blockade rather than conquest. Perhaps then Israel would be forced into a corner like South Africa or Serbia were into the 90s, with its trade cut off, and then its elites might panic and screw over Israel, leave it for dead into some kind of one-state solution like what happened with the Serbs in Bosnia, where the Jews are left as a people to lose their own state and become second-class citizens within the nation that they built. Okay, and now let's get to the conclusion. If the world is being created for us right now, Israel is going to find itself cornered. It will face great difficulties with its own demographic problems, resource scarcity, and the fact that it is surrounded by enemies both abroad and from within. Perhaps like the United Monarchy in the Old Testament and the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Middle Ages, Israel is doomed to only last a century or two before being destroyed by its enemies which surround it and divide it from within. Of course, history is not set, and the Israelis are ultimately the masters of their own destiny. And so perhaps the Zionist project will be more successful than that of the United Monarchy or the Kingdom of Jerusalem, though only time can tell. But now it's time for you to decide, is Israel based?